You're listening to Healthcare Now Radio. Stand by for This Just In, the latest in healthcare innovation and technology trends with your HIT advisor, Justin Barnes.
Thank you for tuning in and welcome to This Just In. I'm your host, Justin Barnes. In these half-hour segments, I'll bring you the latest advancements in healthcare, strategy, innovation, and public policy. As always, we're broadcasting from the This Just In studios on the Business Radio X network, as well as the Healthcare Now radio network. And before we dive into my guest today, I want to take a moment to let everyone know that we'll be broadcasting the This Just In radio show again live from the HIMSS annual conference in Las Vegas on Wednesday, March 7th from 10 a.m. Pacific to 2 p.m. Pacific. Many more details to come here shortly, but I hope everyone is planning on attending the conference. If you're not, though, you'll be able to stream us live at thisjustinradio.com on Wednesday, March 7th. We'll have another great slate of CEO, CIO, leading care providers, industry thought leaders, riveting authors, and certainly policymakers joining this show. For this episode, though, my 115th episode, we're going to speak with Dan Munro, Forbes contributor and author of Casino Healthcare. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We met about a year and a half ago through Roberta Mullins and Carol Flagg. We both were guests on a virtual panel regarding where healthcare was headed based on the two presidential campaigns at the time. So
I remember that.
Yeah, we had a great dialogue, and I think very objectively we covered the basis on what the Clinton campaign was moving forward, and if she became president, what healthcare would look like, and then if the Trump campaign and what if they became president, what healthcare would look like. And I think actually we're fairly spot on. None of us picked the outcome of the election, I don't believe. But
nobody could foresee that one coming.
Right. But leaving politics aside, I'm very excited to make your acquaintance again and have you on this show. You have a great book, Casino Healthcare, and I've read many excerpts from it. And I think the most cool factor that I found in the book is the references to history and what I learned. I love history. I'm a history buff, and you really do educate the reader on the origins of healthcare, Medicare, what companies have done, what the payers have done in the past, and then really where we are. And you do a good job of outlining where we are. You have some conclusions that could differ from my perspective and opinions, but hey, they're all opinions, and we all got them. But right. I'm very happy that you've taken the time to join the show, and actually I'm very excited. I think you're going to be able to join the live radio show while we're at HIMSS in Las Vegas as well. So thank you for that.
Absolutely, and I look forward to it.
So let's start off a little bit before we dive into the book and the questions. A little, background of where you're from, where'd you grow up, go to school, all those good things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually graduated from a high school, which was the International School of Brussels in Brussels, Belgium, before returning to the United States for my first college degree at the University of Redlands, which actually was in journalism and communications. But in those days, as is the case today, there's just not a lot of revenue opportunities, in that emerging market. So I quickly shifted keyboards and went back for a second degree in computer science, and so had a full, basically a full career in computer science as a geekhead, and on the software side of things. And did heads down software development for 4 years for IBM and other companies, and then migrated to the sales and marketing side, and then migrated from there into early stage ventures in software, two of which were in the healthcare space. One was on the payer side, and the other was on the provider side. And so I got a real good tech background on enterprise software for payers and providers, and it gave me some really important technical insight into how the business models work. And then migrated to writing about healthcare in 2011, and that was where I started with Forbes, and I've since written for a number of other publications, and that led up to writing the book.
Yeah, no, that's a great background, and I can tell you've got some, your stuff. When you're talking about different constituencies in healthcare, I can tell you've been part of them in the past, and so it really does come across. Like I said, it's a great educational read as well. So the premise of the book, the system isn't broken; it's working exactly as defined. We just need a different design. And that debate is well underway. And you cover a lot of those aspects. And certainly we've even, since the book was written, healthcare has evolved a little bit. And I want to, certainly touch on that. But starting off, the Milliman Medical Index is a key part of Chapter 4, the big squeeze. Why is this one index so important? Because you reference it throughout the book. So
I do, and it's an important index that I track and I've written about almost every year since 2011. And the reason it's important is because it highlights two things. First of all, it highlights the fact that our system here in the U.S. is a system of tiered coverage. We tier coverage by age, by income, by employment, by military service, by heritage. Even with all that tiering, we still wind up with about 12% of the population that has no health insurance. Mm-hmm. And this differs dramatically from every other industrialized country, which uses systems of what are called universal health coverage. So that's a key element of the Milliman Medical Index, because the Milliman Medical Index highlights the employment category of coverage. And this is, let's face it, the way the vast majority of Americans, about 155 million Americans, get their coverage through their employer. And the employer market for insurance represents what I call inelastic pricing. In effect, it's whatever the market will bear, right, based on the employer size and based on the network that the employer is targeting to access. And the cost is something that the Milliman Medical Index tracks as an average cost for an American family of four for getting PPO coverage through their employer. And that index this year will exceed $27,000. Both the employer contribution and the employee contribution will exceed $27,000 as an average for this year. And it's an index that's been going up as long as I've gone back and tracking it since 2002, mm-hmm. which is basically 16 years. It's gone up every year, and it will go up again this year.
Yeah, no, I agree. So let's get the first part out of the way. And I asked you this offline. What kind of insurance do you currently have? Just kind of put that on the table, and 'cause we understand different perspectives that way too. So what kind of insurance do you
Absolutely. have? Yeah, so we have commercial coverage, and I've referenced this in some of the coverage that I've done on Forbes, because our provider is actually Anthem. And we were a part of the Anthem data breach that happened, I think, 3 years ago, where about 80 million Americans, their health data was potentially compromised by Anthem, and we were a part of that process. So I got a chance to see it firsthand, and so we have commercial coverage through Anthem.
Okay. Yeah, and just for my readers, I haven't really brought this up much in the past, but I have MediShare. I had to do a pretty dramatic shift and change for exactly why your book was written, and just for what we're experiencing as Americans, is my costs were just dramatically going up. I've been self-employed for a long time, and I actually went out to the exchange, but that was just getting astronomical, for my wife and I. We don't have children, but we were paying $12,000 a year to have access to health care. And it was just a joke. And I'm a fiscally responsible person. I'm fiscally minded. I don't like waste anything if I don't have to. And I just saw that as a complete waste. And so I went and researched. And we're Christians, and so MediShare was a great option. And my cost dropped down from about $1,000 a month to $230 a month. And so far, it's been a phenomenal program. So.
And there are those kinds of programs that exist, and they're great because they serve a purpose. And the challenge is that for most Americans, though, that are struggling to find insurance outside of employment, mm-hmm. For example, obviously there's Medicaid, which if you have a low enough income, you can qualify for. If you're over a certain age, you can qualify obviously for Medicare over 65. But there's those gaps where you're not able to get access to employer coverage,
right,
and you're in a family or in an age group or a band where you have to go to the commercial market, and the commercial market is just brutally expensive.
Yes. It is, and it's, your book articulates that, and also why it's so expensive in great ways. So let's dive into the single payer topic. So, is single payer healthcare the ultimate solution, in your opinion, or goal? What are your thoughts there?
So, it tends to get a lot of traction, and it has gotten a lot more traction certainly since Bernie Sanders brought it into the political dialogue with the idea of Medicare for all. The fact is, most Americans understand peripherally how Medicare works. So the idea of simply expanding that to be coverage for every American is an easy concept to understand. But I would argue that Bernie short-circuited the debate because he went straight for discussing about Medicare for all without getting into all of the details of how that would work and how Americans might access that. The reality is that we don't need single payer to get to a system of universal health coverage. And it's the universal health coverage process that is really the biggest single leverage against cost. And the reason is simple. It's because in healthcare, there's actuarial math, which determines the cost of insurance based on the size of the pool. Well, if you divide that pool and slice it and tier it in the way that we have, you get all kinds of opportunities for pricing that are arbitrary and in many cases capricious. And if you simply make everybody a part of the pool, you get the largest possible denominator for every cost. And that becomes, in effect, single pricing healthcare. And that's my argument. How you pay for single pricing healthcare is immaterial. We're a very wealthy country. We can easily afford any system that we choose except one, and that's the one that we have. So is single payer necessary? No. We could use a multi-payer system like other countries have, and probably one of the better examples of that is Germany, which uses a multi-payer model, and they use it fine, but it's predicated on a system of universal health coverage. And so that's the argument that I am passionate about making relative to the articles that I write, and then also the primary argument in the book.
Do you think the payers would go along with it because they're making so much money now? Or where do you think the pressure would come from to make something like that happen? Where would that influence come from?
Well, the interesting aspect of this is the fact that it's a kind of a misperception that the payers are making egregious profits off of this system of commercial coverage. The reality is the net profit margin for commercial payers is relatively low. It's typically well under 5% for most commercial payers. And if you compare that, let's just, take the lens back a little bit and compare it to, say, a company like Apple or even pharmaceutical companies, the net profit margin for those groups is often 20% or more. So the payers aren't really making, in a sense, a lot of money off of the business of coverage. So if you effectively took them all out of the equation completely, I'm not sure you would have the dramatic effect that you would need relative to cost. And so the reality is that they would still be in the business of providing administrative functions, which they do today. And in fact, a large percentage of the payer business isn't even risk or covering risk as much as it is administering the process of healthcare for billing and accounting purposes.
No, I understand. I guess you're probably the first guest that has said that the insurance companies aren't making the profits that we think. And I agree with you. I mean, I agree with the difference between 5% and 20%. But no, I understand. So what's the timeline you see for systemic healthcare reform then? With all that's going on?
Yeah, so in the sense of looking at this historically through the lens of other countries that have approached this, and probably one of the best examples is Canada. Kind of from start to finish, it's typically about a 40 to 50-year timeline. And so that can sound daunting on the one hand. On the other hand, I feel like, and I think that we're about halfway through that kind of a timeline, which is 40 to 50 years.
Yeah.
And the reason I say halfway is because if you go back in the history, our first public recognition, if you will, that we needed to make a systemic change was probably Hillary Care in 1993.
Right.
And so 1993 is kind of the starting point of our public recognition that we were on and we continue to be on a path that's unsustainable. And so 1993 until today is literally 25 years.
Mm-hmm.
So 25 years in a 50-year timeline is probably about right. And of course, since then, we've had a number of other legislative passes, some of which have been more successful than others. Certainly Obamacare had elements of its of success, but it wasn't the dramatic change that we need, and it reflects more of the incremental change towards these other systemic goals.
Yeah, actually, that's a great perspective, and I actually agree with your perspective. So, and it's actually more to kind of put some fuel in there as well. I think, did you see the MedPAC recommendations from about a week ago that they actually voted 14-2 against MACRA and MIPS in the Quality Payment Program? So I think we could see. I don't see Congress taking it up anytime soon, but I do see a lot of consternation with the changes that are trying to be made in healthcare. So
yeah, and it goes back to what it goes back to what President Obama said, kind of as he was walking out the door. He said, progress isn't always linear, right. And it's always it's not always net positive. So that's part of the process that we're engaged in, is the sense that we're going to make these changes and they're going to happen over a period of time. They're not going to be a function of a single piece of legislation or, I think, a single administration.
No, excellent. And for those just tuning in, we're speaking with Dan Munro, Forbes contributor and author of Casino Healthcare. So what are some of the, you mentioned some other countries, Germany, I think you may have mentioned Canada, but are there any other examples of systemic or healthcare reform out there? So
yeah, there's a great one that a lot of people aren't aware of, and I reference it periodically, but I think it's a great example right here in the U.S., is the all-payer system in the state of Maryland. Now, granted, it's a small sort of population in the state of Maryland, which is, I think, it covers about 6 million people. And granted, the all-payer system that they have is for inpatient pricing only, but it's a great model in the sense of getting to single pricing, and they do have plans to extend that more broadly to outpatient services as well. The challenge, of course, is that the single pricing that they use is not tied. They managed to get a waiver through CMS. So the waiver that they have from CMS, in effect, means that all of the other states, all 49 other states, are basically subsidizing the higher price that the all-payer system in Maryland uses for Medicare pricing.
Fascinating.
Actually, it is.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a great example of where I think we're seeing some of those kinds of beachheads where they're more than just experiments. The all-payer system in Maryland has been up and running for a number of years, and I hope and I think they have plans to expand that this year into the outpatient setting, which would be then more of a single pricing model within a single state, and how to then branch that into both other states and then potentially nationally.
Excellent. I initially thought when you started to talk there, you were going to say something. California just rolled out a really cool accountable care or ACO blueprint that I think the rest of the country will be able to follow. It's a different perspective. It actually is working through the payers, but that's about the direction you're initially going to go. But I do know the Maryland program that you're speaking about, and I agree that is something that we can certainly look to. So what's shifting gears a little bit for say the last 6 minutes or so of the show. Let's talk about, certainly want to give a plug, do want people to pick up Casino Healthcare. Great book. Again, a lot of history on where healthcare came from in America, how it's evolved, and how it's evolving today. And then obviously it offers up some solutions here. So a great read for sure. But let's shift a little bit. So what was your pick for a healthcare story in 2017?
Yeah, so without a doubt for me, the biggest single story, which didn't get enough airplay, I thought, was the opioid crisis,
totally
the
agree.
opioid epidemic.
Mm-hmm.
The reason is because just this year, the White House Council of Economic Advisors came out with an estimate. This is a collective group of economic advisors.
Yep.
And they estimate the cost of the opioid crisis for 1 year. This is going back 2 years now, 2015. They estimate the cost of the opioid crisis in 2015 at over $500 billion just for 1 year. And the challenge is that it's not just a cost component, which is huge. It's the huge amount of trouble that it leaves in its wake relative to mental health, substance abuse, and all of the sort of tangential issues that the country is now left with as the result of this crisis, which started with basically, if you go back into the history of it, which I did, by the way. Another great book to read if you haven't read it is a book on this topic, which is called Dreamland. And I can't recommend it enough because it talks about how this mushroom, how this problem and how this crisis mushroomed from its earliest stages. And it started with a letter, a 100-word letter that the pharmaceutical industry relied on for being able to basically to prescribe opioids in a way in which they felt was safe and avoided addiction. And that's obviously not the case. And we're left with the results of that. And we'll be left with the results of that for a long period of time, because $500 billion is a lot of money.
It is. And I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad that we're talking about it. And, I'm glad that the Trump administration is beginning to tackle it. We're tackling it pretty heavily here in Georgia. I'm pretty close with the Attorney General here, and he's got a great task force that he's, put towards this. We're being hit very hard, certainly in the northern parts of Georgia, with opioid abuse. But I think all communities are. And if you don't know that, you do need to research it because it's very serious. So. Yeah,
absolutely.
I agree. So thanks, Dan, for bringing that up. So what do you see for, what are some of the big stories, or what are we going to continue to see? Obviously, the opioid crisis is going to be front and center for 2018 and 2019. But anything else that you see on the horizon this year, next year?
Yeah, so I think we're in a period of what I would call high chaos. And the reason is because there's a strong focus and there's a strong amount of activity geared towards sort of dismantling Obamacare. And I understand the politics behind that. I don't agree with them, but I understand the politics behind that. And I think there will be some success in dismantling that. But it won't change the ultimate trajectory, other than it will change the timeline. And it may be that we've delayed the timeline to some of the systemic changes that we need by 2, 3, or 4 years, but their ultimately the trajectory is unchangeable, because the costs cannot continue to rise in the way that they continue to.
I couldn't agree more. And I agree. I see that chaos out there as well. I see the chaos among providers. I see the chaos among companies. I see the chaos certainly among patients. So
and payers. There's an amount of chaos in the payer community, because they have to price for the year ahead, and they're starting already to think in terms of pricing for 2019. And it's like, how do you price? how do you price this based on an administration that wants to, keep pulling pins on grenades? And so there's a real challenge to that market as well.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. Well, we're basically at time, Dan. You're a great guest. I appreciate you taking the time out. Dan Munro, Forbes contributor and author of Casino Healthcare. And I certainly look forward to seeing you at HIMSS on March 7th, Wednesday, March 7th, and look forward to having you on air there as well.
Absolutely. Look forward to it, and we'll look forward to seeing you in Vegas.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan. And thank you to everyone for listening and joining us today. Please tune in weekdays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, 11:30 a.m. Pacific. As always, you can track me on Twitter at HIT Advisor and use the hashtag ThisJustinRadio so we can respond to your comments from the show. If you missed any of this episode or want to hear more, all my shows are posted on Apple iTunes and out on SoundCloud and iHeartRadio and Spreaker. So very happy to see all that come into fruition. And also you can check out the new website we've launched at justinbarnes.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a terrific week.